something that we'll talk about as well. Okay. Good point.
I can remember the wallpaper on my wall when I was 9 years old.
Okay. That could be an example. Another example I can think of is maybe where you park your car this morning. It's not a very, very good example because other things are involved. But so one thing is visual memory, visual characteristics of something, like hair color of another person, your mom, when you were 5, for example. Now, so it can be classified depending on the stimulus domain. How about a verbal memory? What is a verbal memory?
Like if we go home from class and we remember something we said.
Right. So what I just said could be a piece of verbal memory. And also earlier, one of you mentioned short-term versus long-term memory. That's another way that people have tried to classify memory. And what I want to emphasize here is that a lot of these models actually overlap. And even though we're only focusing on 2 of those, I want you to understand that it's mostly an integration of what other people have proposed so far. So if you look at the following 2 figures and realize that you never actually see anything that is exactly the same as what you see here today, don't be surprised. We're pulling a lot of things together. And we only want you to focus on the things that we think is important. Okay? So let's go to a simpler model. So the first stage would be encoding, which refers to the process of getting information into your memory system. Is that clear? Now, the second stage will be storage, of course. And it refers to the manner in which information is being represented and kept in memory. I think he's going to upload the slides, by the way. I was told that usually he does that after class. Now, the third stage would be retrieval, which is one thing that has been brought up over and over earlier today. And there are different kinds of retrieval. So it refers to how you get information back out to the foreground from your memory storage. So we're going to talk about each of the 3 stages. The first stage, encoding. What does that mean? Can somebody give me an example of encoding of information?
Saying something over and over again to try to remember it.
Okay, good. So that's one strategy to help facilitate actually the transfer from encoding to storage. Yes? Anything else?
I think like blocking out interference and taking one thing in.
Sure. So trying to block out things that are unnecessary, trying to focus on what you need to learn. And there are actually many different strategies when it comes to encoding. Now, there is one theory, at least, that proposes that the depth of processing, meaning how deep you process information when you encode those information, would greatly affect how you store the memory eventually, and also your ability to retrieve it later on. So encoding is very important. When we talk about depth of processing, there can be things like organization, for example. If you give people a memory task, if you ask them to categorize, for example, you give them 12 words, either in a list in which they're being categorized into 3 different categories, or if you just give them a random list of 12 words, then usually people would do better with the categorized list later on. So it goes to show that organization typically helps. And here we're talking about memory in general, not just for people who are old or slightly older. Now, there are other types of encoding strategies and things that, and when we talk about the depth of processing, how deep you process information. For example, I think one of you mentioned it earlier today, rehearsal, repeating things to yourself, making an effort. Usually that helps. And also elaboration. So these are very, very basic strategies that would talked about for both young people, young and old, school age, even right now in class, for you to encode, you're actively engaging in the process of encoding all these information. And depending on how you decide to learn these information, you're encoding it with different strategies. Right? Is that clear? Yes.
What if you're like not doing anything, you know, consciously? Then what's happening?
That's a great point. So what do you think about this comment about not doing anything at all while there is some sensory input, some information out there?
Just from personal experience, it seems like some of it gets in and is remembered, and some of it doesn't.
That's a very good point, because later on in the second model, we're going to address that a little bit more about the automatic process. Because the idea is that with encoding, it doesn't have to be just the deliberate processing of information. There's also the automatic side to it. But whether you're going to get all of it by just sitting passively, that's another issue.
The automatic encoding, do you mean subconsciously encoding?
We're not talking so much about the three-stage theory, the processing right now. It's but I'll go back to that. Make sure I go back to that later when we talk about automatic processing. Okay. Alice? And just that question, the issue of whether when you're sitting down, when information comes to you, if you're not actively doing anything, is it really the case that you're not actively doing anything?
Doing something, even if it's not intentional. You know, I mean, you remember things without thinking about them.
Okay. And why might that be the case? Why wouldn't you remember the buzzing noise in the background of the room?
Because of inhibition?
Or habituation as well. So there's some cognitive processes going on, even if you're not really actively trying to encode. Because you do have to filter out all these things like the room temperature. That's a piece of information as well. Why are we not paying attention to the room temperature until or unless it's really, really cold?
Yeah, you don't really sometimes notice something unless it's like out of the normal.
Right. And that it's adaptive as well.
Yeah, typically you notice changes as opposed to constant things.
Right. Exactly. So that's the way how our mind works, actually. And we do tend to filter out things that are irrelevant or unimportant to us. And there's certain things that get encoded better, and there are things that we filter out. Okay. Any other questions? No? Okay. So in terms of age-related differences, because here we're not only going over all the models about memory, we're also talking about, in the aging context, age differences. What do you think may be some of the age-related differences in encoding? You might have read some of it from one of the articles.
Or they might not be able to get all the information correctly, like if they have hearing or sight loss.
That's a very, very good point. A lot of times, if people don't encode, if they can't hear, if they can't see, then how are they supposed to gather the information? So that's a great point. Now, and so because of that, if there are also age-related sensory and perceptual losses, it could affect their encoding. Now, what else may be going on?
Maybe like, oh, I don't know if that's my term, but maybe you have just more wisdom or whatever, so you know, well, I don't need to remember that. Like,
Okay.
so you selectively
Filter out certain
Yeah.
things? Okay. So that's another point about attention. We'll go back to that idea later on. So in terms of encoding, it's really true that a lot of times when older adults and also young people are giving, say, a divided attention task, very similar to chapter 15, which you have read, say a reaction time task, on top of the memory task. And this time, because in chapter 15, I believe